Hello, welcome back to Inside the Birds NFC East preview show. I'm Geoff Mosher with Adam Caplan, and of course, we are previewing the NFC East as we do every summer, and we bring in the godfather of tape breakdown, Greg Cosell. We have already started this series. We have previewed the Dallas Cowboys, and we are on to the New York Football Giants, a team that has not been very good. Yes, we know they made the playoffs a couple of years ago, but in general, they have really struggled to put together some consistency and be what they were back in the 90s. So, Greg, we're going to go through the Giants. They finished 3-14 last year. And
that's not good, is it?
No, last I checked, that's a lot of losses, not very many wins. And they still didn't get a quarterback in the top 5, although they did draft a first-round quarterback that we will speak of. So let's get right into the Giants. We'll talk about them offensively. They are very interesting, I think, for people because not only did they sign Jameis Winston, who we thought would be the bridge quarterback, but then they went and got Russell Wilson and then drafted Jackson Dart. So when you put these three together, what comes to mind here for the New York Giants?
It's funny. It appears that Wilson will be the starter. I know there's still a whole training camp, so maybe I'm talking out of my rear end. I can't get Jameis Winston out of my head. Because, the last time, I know Winston played in Cleveland a little bit, and he was very up and down. And, there was nothing about that said, oh, Jameis is really good. But I just remember the last time he was a true starter, and that was with the New Orleans Saints. And that's when he, tore up his knee, and he was playing at a really high level. And I've always thought, and I know people point to the interceptions, and maybe that's but that's who he is, that he'll always throw a couple – or more than a couple where you just scratch your head. But, I always thought Jameis Winston could play quarterback in this league and at a reasonably high level. But we'll see how it plays out. If Russell Wilson is your starting quarterback, you have a certain kind of offense because he's a limited player. And now your run game has to be a big factor. Obviously they have Tyrone Tracy, but they also drafted the kid from Arizona, who's fascinating. Scatterbo, who,
Arizona State, correct?
Arizona State, excuse me, correct. Yeah. And, the more I watched this kid, the more I liked him. And I remember in my notes, I'm not going to sit here and read my notes, but I remember my notes saying that, this whole thing about feature backs, guys that carry the ball a lot, you sort of have to change your opinion a little bit. I mean, we've mentioned this 100 times. Kyron Williams, who's probably going to get a contract, was a 5th-round pick out of Notre Dame, okay? And look what he's done. He carried 316 times last year and didn't play in the final game. Now, I'm not saying Scatterbo's carrying 300 times, but I think Scatterbo has the physicality, the toughness to be a sort of feature-type back, and he's an attitude back. And he's a really good receiver. So and they still have Singletary. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out with Tracy, Singletary, and Scatterbo. And they need a run game. If Russell Wilson is your starting quarterback, you need a meaningful run game. If you want to use the word balance and put it on a spectrum, like if right in the middle, your run game has to be a little higher with Russell Wilson, the quarterback, as opposed to a little lower.
What's your sense on when it becomes Russell Wilson or Winston or even Jackson?
And I want to get Greg on Jackson Dart in a minute, but I'll tell you that the marriage between the head coach who's going to call the plays, Brian Daboll and Wilson, because Daboll's got a short fuse. Wilson, his careers have been about big play and holding on to the ball, trying to be Superman. I know he's older. You question how well he moves. With this offensive line and their issues, man, this could be fascinating. So Greg, if I send it to you, you've got Jackson Dart. What does his tape look like, and what do you think of him with Daboll's offense?
I kept going back and forth on Jackson Dart when I watched his tape, and I watched him last summer, and of course I watched him in great detail this year because as I started watching him, I sensed he could be polarizing, and it is somewhat he was to me. Dart's an interesting player. The mobility is a factor. You've got to you do have to factor that into the equation. Everybody always says, well, he's not special. Well, I don't know what they mean when they say that. There's only one Lamar Jackson. There's only one Josh Allen who's 6'5", 240. there's only one Mahomes with his sense of spatial awareness. So you can't just start saying, well, it's not special. He's going to run for first downs. I mean, he may not, be the fastest guy on the field, but that's a part of his game that's meaningful. I think he's a good thrower. I don't think he's a great thrower. I thought that at times his deeper throws lost a little energy on the back end. Sometimes he works hard to throw the ball. I think he needs, in some ways, he needs what Russell Wilson needs. He needs a complete offense. Now he's supposed to be, from everybody I've talked to, an unbelievable kid, the kind of kid that people gravitate toward. We'll see how it plays out. Look, they drafted him to be their quarterback, maybe not game one this year, but to be their quarterback. So it's just a matter of time, and if we'll get to their defense, which by the way, has a chance to be very, very good. So we'll get to that. But offensively, I think this season early on will be a meaningful work in progress.
So it always, with the Giants for the last few years, has been a discussion about the offensive line. It's hurt the quarterback. It's hurt their passing game. It's hurt the running game. But interestingly, here's what I think is interesting. They didn't really make too many changes to it. And people are going to say, well, then they're still going to stink. But there was a time period last year, Greg, I think we were talking with you about this, where when Andrew Thomas was healthy,
yes,
their offensive line was actually playing decent. It wasn't the sieve that had been 2 years ago. And you look, assuming Thomas comes back healthy, Runyon's still at left guard, John Michael Schmitz at center, Greg Van Roten, Adam's favorite right guard there, and Jermaine Illuminor right tackle. That still, to me, is far from elite, but it can get the job done if it stays healthy.
Yeah, if they can stay healthy. Thomas is a good left tackle. John Runyon's a solid player. They drafted Schmitz out of Minnesota in the second round. They're expecting him again to be, sort of a centerpiece. You don't draft a center in the second round, to be a guy. You draft him to be a good guy. It's the right side. Look, the Evan Neal deal hasn't worked out at tackle. He was a first-round pick and a high first-round pick. They've moved him to guard. In an ideal world, they'd like him to beat out Van Roten, who's been with a lot of teams, and you can line up with him, but you'd prefer to have, a better guy. So we'll see how the Evan Neal experiment works. If the O-line can be just above average, they've got some interesting players on the outside. We know what Malik Neighbors is. Slayton has hung around because you know what? Slayton makes, to sound cliched, but true, Slayton makes big plays, and he's not going to catch 90 balls, but he has those games, Adam, where all of a sudden
he
Slayton
can run
two 45-yard, 50-yard touchdowns. He's a weird guy. I have read some quotes from Dable that Jalen Hyatt, they're saying that he's really a different guy now. Until you play the games, we don't know, but we'll find out because he was a pretty high pick as well. So they've got a bunch of guys. I think they brought in Zach Pascal, and I think that was a good move because he's just one of those savvy veteran types that can, be around young players, and he certainly can play in certain packages. So we'll see. The O-line, it kind of really depends on the O-line. I guess we'll see who the quarterback is, but I think the run game is going to have to be a big factor here.
Yeah, and I would add two things. And what I like about this offense, Geoff, in terms of talent, you also have Wan'Dale Robinson who could play inside. He's little gadgety. He's on a contract year. Then a guy I know we all like coming into last year's draft is Theo Johnson, who could run, Greg. So
yeah,
Geoff, they've got plenty of talent on offense, but can they protect?
I think that's always been the question. And again, depth on the O-line, right? I mean, their starters can hold their own. We've seen that. But if they have one or two injuries, how corrupted will this offense be? I think is the
big thing. They did bring in some veteran guys who played meaningful snaps in the NFL. Okay, in Aaron Stinney, in Austin Schlottman. I mean, again, we're not saying that these guys are stars. That's not the point. But they've played meaningful snaps in the NFL. So if they did have to play those guys, they're not putting in, rookie types or guys that have, not played in the league. They've played guys. They're bringing in guys that have played a lot of snaps in the NFL, Geoff. So again, I don't want to come across as like, oh, this is a great old line, but they did that intentionally because they know what the line has been, and they just wanted guys with NFL experience.
Makes sense. And again, when you talk about potential, if things go well, this offensive line holds up, the quarterback and running game are better, then they certainly have those outside. I'm really curious to see how Theo Johnson will do in year 2, but certainly with Malik Neighbors as a star, we saw that. Slayton can stress his defense. And I thought Wan'Dale Robinson was
he's a pure slot. I mean,
good slot for them.
Mostly pure slot guy.
Right. So
he
they can
run
move the chains.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, Geoff, as we will get started with defense in about 30 seconds, but to use a Cosell line, it's there. There's something there with this offense.
There's something inside them.
Yeah, it's there. But they just have never been able to put it. It starts and ends.
The O-line has been a huge problem.
Yeah. All right. So let us now then transition to defense, because this is where it's really there, right, Greg? I mean, the talent. And if it doesn't have to be relied on to win every single game and try to win 15-3 every week, this defense, if it's even gets a little rest, can be very, very good.
They've got a really good D coordinator in Shane Bowen, who's been around the league, does some really nice things with pressure schemes. But I mean, if you look at this group overall, I mean, it's, Dexter Lawrence will be back. He's a man and a half. They got, some interesting players up front. They drafted the kid from Toledo, Darius Alexander, who's a very intriguing prospect. It's hard to know coming from the MAC if he'll be ready, as a rookie to play meaningful snaps, but he's got pretty high-level traits. And, of course, now on the edges in their base, whether you want to call it a 5-2 or a 3-4, they're going to have Brian Burns and Abdul Carter. And that's, those are two explosive athletes that have to be dealt with. And I got to tell you, their two linebackers, Okereke and McFadden, they're good football players. They're not stars and impact players, but they're just really good players. And what they did on the back end, and I think was they needed it. They brought in, Paulson Adebo from New Orleans, who's a solid corner. He'll start. And Javon Holland, who did not have a great year last year, but Javon Holland, when healthy and playing, had a great conversation with a coach in the league about safeties, and the term he used was 5-tool safeties. And he felt that the two best 5-tool safeties in the NFL, when they're playing their best, I mean, that's what are Minkah Fitzpatrick and Javon Holland. And Javon Holland at his best is a really good player. And I think bringing Holland and Adebo in was also done intentionally for Banks, because Banks is a really high-level traits corner. But, again, I don't know Banks, but from everything you read and hear, he's just an immature kid who still doesn't quite know how to be a pro. Adam could probably speak a little more about that, but he's super gifted. And I'm sure they hope that the veterans can sort of teach this kid, how to be an NFL player, because this kid can line up. And I remember watching him coming out of Maryland, matching up to Marvin Harrison, and it was a great watch.
Greg, if you look at the secondary, you mentioned Paulson Adebo coming over from New Orleans. With Banks, if he could play more consistent football, Phillips is their second-year nickel. Holland,
and Tyler Newman
is
a really quality safety,
right? So Chauncey Golston will come off the bench. Roy Robinson Harris has always been a nice player.
Yeah,
who they got in free agency. So
with
Barnes
and Thibodeau, whose snaps are probably going to decrease.
Yeah, and you put in Thibodeau as the first guy off the bench. Well, although initially Thibodeau might be starting.
Yeah.
How good could this defense be under Bowen?
I think it could be very good. I mean, I think it'll be their strength for sure. Obviously you bring in new players. It's how quickly can you put it all together.
Yeah.
Look, there's so much detail. I've been fortunate to be able to be in meetings at times through the years, and there's just so much detail. It's unbelievable. It blows me away. I mean, I know this because of tape I watch too, but every time I'm able to sit in a meeting, the detail, quite frankly, I don't understand how these players do it. It just blows me away. But it's that's what it comes down to, is how quickly you can assimilate, because Shane Bowen's really good with pressure. Not pressure the way maybe you think of like Rex Ryan, all that pressure. Yeah. He's really good with simulated pressures, rushing 4. He's really good at that. He's really good at overloads where you might only rush 4, maybe 5. But, he's just really good. And that requires a ton of detail. So we'll see how it all plays out. We'll see what they do with Abdul Carter. I mean, Abdul Carter, maybe year 1, you just say, there's the quarterback, go get him. I mean, he'll have a lot to learn.
Well, I would think Well, so this is what I'm curious, and we talked about this even with Matt Eberflus in Dallas. Is this going to be a 4-man rush where it's go get the quarterback, or with the versatility he has,
Yes.
and with what Abdul Carter showed at Penn State to be able to move from off-ball linebacker to edge, can that learning curve be just as fast in the NFL where you can be more versatile with him and not just say, go get the quarterback?
I think they'd like that.
If you can, that would be an amazing advantage, right?
Then it depends on Carter and how quickly he picks things up. And, because because you have to hit exact gaps. It's not just, hey, let's go get the quarter.
Exactly.
When you have pressure concepts, people might not think of it this way, but this is the way it is. You're working in tandem with others. I remember years ago, this just popped into my head. I remember years ago doing a radio show with Quentin Michael. Okay. And I asked him, what's the thing that gets Jim Johnson, the old Eagles D coordinator, one of the best who ever did it? I said, what gets him the most pissed off? And he says, when guys don't rush the quarterback with the needed discipline, because it's not just let's go run and get him. You have to hit specific gaps. It all works together. And I noticed that on tape. We do plays like that on the matchup show, where, hey, this guy's going to go here. This, you have to hit. It's all about discipline. And, those things you have to learn.
Yeah. We've had Quentin on a lot, and he's actually given specific examples of guys like sort of running into each other.
Yeah. You see that on tape a lot.
Yeah.
That's when you probably get a lot of creative cursing upstairs from the defensive coach.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, Geoff, real quick. So the one thing that could hold this team back is their first quarter of the season at Washington, at Dallas, home against the Chiefs, home against the Chargers. Good luck.
Yeah.
So, their roster's clearly better. But if they could go 2-2 after 4 weeks, consider that a win for them.
100%. I think this will be a big growth and development year, obviously for the defense and obviously for the quarterback. But can they do that and also stay competitive, try to get a last seed in the playoffs, just try to get themselves building in the right direction?
Well, it would seem to me that the whole I don't want to say the whole purpose, but a very high percentage purpose of this season is to develop Jackson Dart. Because look, they signed Wilson, who's clearly at the end. They signed Winston, who seemingly has fallen into that journeyman, just go somewhere, wherever that may be, So the whole purpose of this season is to develop Jackson Dart.
Yeah, absolutely. And on defense, Craig, you guys talked about this to wrap it up. They seem to have either a proven very good player or a guy who, like, whether it's a Newbin or a Carter or somebody who's emerging there, Darius Alexander, someone who we expect to have a trajectory to be a pretty good player. And that's a good recipe for a solid defense from top to bottom. Be very interesting.
The other thing they brought in on defense as free agents is they brought in guys who've been with winning teams that are not stars, and they're probably special teamers, like Chris Board from Baltimore, like Flanagan Falls from San Francisco. Guys who've been with winning teams. These guys are special teamers, but they've started and played meaningful snaps in the NFL. And again, you don't want them to have to play meaningful snaps, Geoff, but they've been with winning programs. And, it's just like I mentioned, the offensive lineman they brought in. I think, all this is done intentionally. It's not a fluke.
Well, we'll see if it pays off for the New York Giants. They really need to get their act together and start to become a formidable franchise once again. So that is now 2 of the 4 NFC teams we have wrapped up, the Dallas Cowboys and the New York Giants. And then we will be on to the Washington Commanders and, of course, finish up with the Philadelphia Eagles. And we will continue to do it with the man, Greg Cosell. So for Greg Cosell and Adam Caplan, I'm Geoff Mosher. Thanks for watching our NFC East preview show.